The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger with each passing hour, and Delilah Morgan stood on the porch of her father's ranch house, watching it approach with a mixture of curiosity and unease. It was July 1883, and strangers didn't often venture this far into the remote hills of Republic, Washington, where the summer heat baked the earth and the nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away. She wiped her hands on her apron, her dark hair falling loose from its bun, and squinted against the bright afternoon sun. The rider was still too far away to make out clearly, but something about the determined pace of the horse told her this wasn't a casual traveler passing through. Her father had died 3 months ago, a sudden heart attack that left Delilah alone on the ranch at 22 years old. The townspeople had expected her to sell, to move back east where her aunt lived in Philadelphia, but Delilah had grown up on this land. She knew every fence post, every water source, every trail through the pine forests that surrounded the valley. She wasn't about to abandon everything her father had built just because some folks thought a woman couldn't manage alone. The rider came closer, and she could see now it was a man on a tall roan horse that looked like it had traveled hard. He sat straight in the saddle despite what must have been a long journey, his hat pulled low against the sun. Delilah's hand moved instinctively to the rifle she kept by the door, but she didn't pick it up. Not yet. When he was 50 yards out, the rider slowed his horse to a walk, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. Delilah stepped off the porch, her boots crunching on the dry earth, and waited. The man drew his horse to a stop a respectful distance away, and dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal sandy brown hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with gray eyes that held both exhaustion and something else she couldn't quite name. "Name's Thomas Wyatt. I'm looking for Frank Morgan." Delilah's throat tightened. "My father passed this spring. I'm Delilah Morgan. This is my land now." Something flickered across Thomas Wyatt's face, disappointment mixed with genuine sorrow. He turned his hat in his hands, and she noticed the dust caked into every crease of his clothes, the stubble on his jaw, the way his horse stood with its head lowered in exhaustion. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Morgan. I rode a long way hoping to find him." His voice was rough, probably from days on the trail with little water. "Your father and mine were friends back during the war. My pa died last year, and before he went, he told me if I ever needed help, Frank Morgan was a man I could trust." "You rode all the way from where?" Delilah asked, studying him carefully. There was an honesty in his face that made her want to believe him, but she'd learned to be cautious. "Montana, near Helena." Thomas looked at his horse, then back at her. "It's been about a month on the trail. I've got trouble following me, and I didn't want to bring it to your door, but I'm running out of options." "What kind of trouble?" Thomas hesitated, and Delilah saw him weighing how much to tell her. "The kind that involves 3 men who think I stole something that belongs to them. I didn't, but they're not interested in the truth. And you thought my father could help you prove your innocence. Something like that." Thomas glanced back at the horizon, and Delilah followed his gaze. The sun was starting to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I understand if you want me to move on. I don't mean to be a burden to you." Delilah made a decision that would change everything. "Your horse needs rest, and you look like you could use a meal and a place to sleep. We can talk more after you've had a chance to recover." The surprise on Thomas's face was almost comical. "Madam, I couldn't impose." "It's Delilah, and you're not imposing. My father would have helped you, so I will too. But I'll tell you right now, if you're lying to me about anything, I'm a very good shot." She said it matter-of-factly and watched a small smile tug at the corner of Thomas's mouth. "Yes, madam." "I mean, Delilah." She showed him to the barn where he could stable his horse, watching as he carefully removed the saddle and rubbed the animal down with more attention than most men would give after such a hard journey. His hands were gentle despite their roughness, and he spoke softly to the roan, promising rest and good feed. Delilah found herself noticing the breadth of his shoulders, the way his shirt stuck to his back with sweat and dust. "I've got stew on the stove," she said when he finished. "Come inside and wash up." The ranch house was modest but well kept, with wooden floors her father had planed himself and furniture he'd built over the years. Delilah had always been proud of their home, even if it wasn't fancy like the houses in town. She pointed Thomas to the pump out back where he could wash, then ladled stew into 2 bowls and set out fresh bread she'd baked that morning. When Thomas returned, his face scrubbed clean and his hair damp, she was struck by how young he looked. Not a boy, but not yet hardened by the kind of life that aged men before their time. They sat at the table, and for a few minutes there was only the sound of eating. She could tell he was hungry, trying not to wolf down the food but clearly having trouble restraining himself. "When did you last eat?" she asked. "2 days ago, dried meat I'd packed." Thomas looked up at her, and his eyes were remarkably clear despite his exhaustion. "This is the best meal I've had in a month, thank you." "Tell me about this trouble you're running from," Delilah said, settling back in her chair. "The whole story." Thomas set down his spoon and took a long breath. "I was working as a ranch hand outside Helena. The owner, Marcus Brennan, he's a hard man but fair enough. He had a strongbox in his office with the ranch payroll, about $3,000. Someone broke in one night and stole it. The next morning, Brennan's foreman found some of my things scattered near the office, a bandana and a knife with my initials. I swear to you I didn't take that money, but Brennan's 3 sons, they didn't want to wait for any marshal or trial. They came after me with guns. So you ran." "I didn't have much choice. I figured I'd head to my pa's old friend, someone who knew my family and might believe me. Along the way, I've been trying to stay ahead of the Brennan boys, but they're persistent. I think they're more interested in revenge than justice at this point." Delilah considered this. "Why would someone plant your things near the scene?" "That's what I've been trying to figure out. Either it was random bad luck, or someone on that ranch wanted me gone." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I'm not a thief, Delilah. I know you have no reason to believe me, but it's the truth." She found herself believing him, which was either very wise or very foolish. "How far behind are the Brennan boys?" "I've managed to keep a few days ahead of them, but they're trackers, all 3 of them. They'll follow my trail here eventually. Then we need to figure out what to do before they arrive." Delilah stood and began clearing the dishes. "You can sleep in the barn tonight. Tomorrow we'll make a plan." "I could just leave," Thomas said quietly. "Lead them away from here. The last thing I want is to bring trouble to your door. It's too late for that. If they're tracking you, they've already seen where you went. And besides," Delilah met his eyes steadily, "my father always said running from a problem just makes it chase you harder. Sometimes you have to turn and face it." That night, Delilah lay in her bed listening to the sounds of the ranch, the same sounds she'd heard all her life. The wind in the pines, the occasional call of an owl, the rustling of the horses in the barn. But now there was something different, someone different, sleeping in her barn. She thought about Thomas Wyatt and his gray eyes, the way he'd thanked her for a simple meal as if she'd given him something precious. She thought about the trust her father had apparently shared with Thomas's father, 2 men who'd fought together and forged a bond strong enough to last years and miles. When morning came, she found Thomas already up and working. He'd fed all the horses, including her 2 mares, and was mending a section of fence that had been damaged weeks ago when a tree branch fell during a storm. Delilah had been meaning to fix it herself, but hadn't found the time. "You didn't have to do that," she said, walking up with 2 cups of coffee. Thomas accepted the cup gratefully. "I'm not one to take charity without giving something back. Besides, I'm used to working." They stood together in the early morning light, the air still cool before the day's heat set in. Delilah noticed things about Thomas she'd been too cautious to see the night before. The way he moved with economy and purpose, the quiet competence in everything he did, the way he looked at her when she spoke as if her words truly mattered. "I've been thinking," she said, "about your situation. If someone planted evidence against you, there might be a reason beyond just random bad luck. Who on the Brennan Ranch might have wanted you gone?" Thomas frowned, considering. "There was the foreman, Jake Hutchins. He never liked me much, thought I was too friendly with Brennan's daughter. Not that anything was happening between us, but Jake's got a jealous nature. Is Jake the type who might steal from his employer? I wouldn't have thought so. He's worked for Brennan for 10 years, but $3,000 is a lot of money." Thomas paused, his expression thoughtful. "There was something strange, now that I think about it. The night before the theft, Jake told me to switch my usual patrol route, said he needed me to check the south pasture instead of the areas near the main house. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. So he made sure you weren't near the office, but he left your things there to frame you. It's possible, but proving it from 1,000 miles away seems impossible." Delilah smiled. "Maybe not as impossible as you think. My father had connections throughout Montana from his Army days. There's a marshal in Missoula who owes our family a favor. I could write to him, explain the situation, ask him to investigate." Hope sparked in Thomas's eyes, the first real hope she'd seen there. "You do that for me. After knowing me for less than a day, my father believed in your father. That's enough for me. And besides," she added with a slight smile, "I'm a pretty good judge of character. You're not a thief, Thomas Wyatt." The next few days fell into a pattern. Thomas worked around the ranch, tackling repairs and improvements that Delilah had been putting off. She wrote letters, including one to the marshal in Missoula and another to an old friend of her father's who still lived near Helena. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and talk, sharing stories about their lives, their families, their dreams. Delilah learned that Thomas had grown up helping his father run a small freight business, that his mother had died when he was 12, that he'd always wanted to have his own ranch someday. Thomas learned that Delilah had been educated by her mother before she passed, that she could read Latin and do complex mathematics, that she'd once dreamed of being a teacher, but loved the land too much to leave. "You're not what I expected," Thomas said one evening as the sun set in a blaze of crimson and gold. "What did you expect? I don't know. Someone more fragile, maybe. Someone who needed protecting." He looked at her with those clear gray eyes. "But you're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Delilah felt warmth spread through her chest. "I had to be. My mother died when I was 15. My father needed help running this place, and I wasn't about to let him down. He must have been very proud of you. I hope so." Her voice caught slightly, and Thomas reached over, his hand covering hers where it rested on the porch railing. His touch was warm and calloused and sent an electric jolt through her. "I'm sure of it," he said softly. They sat like that as the stars emerged, hands touching, something unspoken but profound building between them. Delilah had never felt this way about anyone, this combination of comfort and excitement, of knowing someone and wanting to know everything about them. It frightened her a little, how quickly Thomas had become important to her. On the 6th day after Thomas's arrival, 3 riders appeared on the horizon. Delilah was in the garden when she saw them, and her heart dropped into her stomach. She ran to the barn where Thomas was shoeing one of the horses. "They're here," she said. "3 men coming from the east." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he didn't look panicked. "The Brennan boys. We knew they'd come eventually." Delilah gripped his arm. "Let me do the talking. This is my land, and they have no authority here." They walked together to the front of the house, and Delilah picked up her rifle on the way. She held it casually but visibly as the 3 riders approached. They were rough-looking men in their 20s and early 30s, with the hard eyes of people who'd grown up expecting to get their way. The oldest one, a man with a thick black beard, spoke first. "We're looking for a thief named Thomas Wyatt. We tracked him here." "Mr. Wyatt is a guest on my property," Delilah said coolly, "and you're trespassing." "We don't want trouble with you, madam," the bearded man said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly concerned about causing trouble. "We just want what's ours." "He stole $3,000 from our father." "I didn't steal anything," Thomas said firmly, "and I've been trying to figure out who actually did." The second Brennan brother, lean and sharp-featured, spat on the ground. "We found your stuff at the scene. That's all the proof we need." "That's not how the law works," Delilah interjected. "You need actual evidence, not just circumstantial findings. And last I checked, vigilante justice isn't legal in Montana or Washington." "This isn't your concern," the third brother said. He was younger than the others, maybe 25, with nervous hands that kept moving to the gun at his hip. "It became my concern when you rode onto my land making accusations." Delilah raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it but making her intentions clear. "Now I suggest you turn around and head back where you came from. If you want justice, take it up with the proper authorities." The bearded man's face darkened. "We rode 1,000 miles following this thief. We're not leaving without him." "Yes, you are." Delilah's voice was steel. "Because you're outnumbered and outgunned. I've got 3 ranch hands who will be back from the north pasture any minute now." It was a lie. She had no ranch hands. But the Brennan brothers didn't know that. Thomas stepped forward slightly. "Wait. I want to ask you something." "How well do you know Jake Hutchins?" The question seemed to throw them off. The bearded brother frowned. "Our foreman, we've known him for years." "Why?" "Did you know he told me to change my patrol route the night before the theft? Made sure I was far from the main house." "So what? That's his job." "And did you ever wonder why my things were so conveniently found right near the scene? Almost like someone wanted you to think I was guilty." The sharp-featured brother shifted in his saddle. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe Jake Hutchins stole your father's money and set me up to take the fall. $3,000 is enough for a man to disappear and start a new life." "That's ridiculous," the bearded man said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Delilah seized on it. "Is it? When was the last time anyone actually saw Jake Hutchins? Is he still at your ranch, or did he happen to disappear around the same time you started chasing Thomas?" The 3 brothers looked at each other, and Delilah could see the doubt creeping in. The youngest one spoke up. "Dale, you remember Pa said something about Jake acting strange that week. Said he'd asked for his wages early." Dale, the bearded brother, scowled. "That doesn't prove anything." "But it's worth investigating," Thomas pressed. "Look, I understand you want to protect your father's property. I respect that. But chasing an innocent man across 2 territories doesn't help anyone. Why don't you go back, check on Jake Hutchins, and see if my theory holds water? If I'm wrong, you know where to find me." It was a risk, putting himself back in their crosshairs, but Delilah could see the logic. The brothers were angry, but they weren't stupid. If there was even a chance they'd been chasing the wrong man, they needed to know. After a long, tense moment, Dale nodded slowly. "We'll look into it. But if you're lying, Wyatt, If this is just some story to buy yourself time, we'll be back. And next time we won't be so patient." "Fair enough," Thomas said. The Brennan brothers turned their horses and rode off, and Delilah and Thomas stood watching until they disappeared over the hills. Then Delilah's legs went weak, and she had to sit down on the porch steps. The rifle clattered beside her. "That was terrifying," she admitted. Thomas sat down next to her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You were incredible. I've never seen anyone face down 3 armed men like that. I was bluffing about the ranch hands. I know, but they didn't." He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Delilah, you could have just handed me over. It would have been easier, safer for you. Why didn't you?" "Because it would have been wrong." She met his eyes, feeling the pull between them like a physical force. "And because I believe in you, Thomas. I believe you're a good man who got dealt a bad hand." "I've been thinking," he said softly, his hand finding hers, "about what you said, that running from a problem just makes it chase you harder. I've been running my whole life in one way or another. Running from the memory of my mother's death, from the responsibility of settling down, from anything that might hurt me. But these past days with you, I haven't wanted to run. For the first time in years, I've wanted to stay somewhere." Delilah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Thomas, I know I have no right to say this. I'm still a wanted man, even if we planted some doubt in those brothers' minds. I've got nothing to offer you but trouble and hard work. But Delilah Morgan, somewhere in the past week, I fell in love with you, with your strength and your kindness and the way you face the world head on. And I needed you to know that, even if nothing can come of it." She should have been cautious. She should have reminded him that they'd only known each other a week, that love took time to grow, that the circumstances were all wrong. But when she looked at Thomas, she saw her future. She saw morning coffee on the porch and shared work in the fields and conversations that lasted long into the night. She saw a partner, an equal, someone who wouldn't try to change her or diminish her but would stand beside her. "Then stay," she whispered. "When this is all sorted out, when your name is cleared, stay here with me. Help me run this ranch, build a life here." Thomas's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Are you sure? You deserve better than a drifter with a questionable past." "I deserve someone who sees me for who I am, someone who rode 1,000 miles looking for help and found something else instead." She smiled, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "You're not a drifter, Thomas. You're exactly where you're meant to be." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home. His lips were warm and soft against hers, and she felt the careful restraint in the way he held her, as if she were something precious that might break. But Delilah was not fragile, and she kissed him back with all the feelings she'd been holding inside, all the loneliness of the past months, and the unexpected joy of finding someone who understood her. They pulled apart slowly, foreheads resting together, breathing the same air. The sun had fully set now, and the stars were brilliant overhead, the same stars that had watched over this land for thousands of years. "I love you too," Delilah said. "I think I started falling for you the moment you were gentle with your exhausted horse. I've never felt this way about anyone, and it scares me a little, how fast it happened. My pa used to say that when you know, you know. He said he fell in love with my mother the day they met, and they had 15 wonderful years together before she passed." Thomas smiled, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "I used to think he was exaggerating, but now I understand." The next weeks were both anxious and wonderful. They waited for news from Montana, working side by side to prepare the ranch for the coming winter. Thomas proved to be an invaluable help, strong and skilled and never complaining about the long hours. They fell into an easy rhythm, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with looks and small gestures as much as with words. In the evenings, they talked about the future they hoped to build. Thomas wanted to expand the horse breeding operation, said he'd noticed Delilah's mares had excellent bloodlines. Delilah wanted to improve the irrigation system, maybe plant an orchard on the south-facing slope. They planned and dreamed together, and every day the connection between them grew stronger. A month after the Brennan brothers' visit, a letter arrived. Delilah's hands shook as she opened it, Thomas standing close behind her, his presence a steadying force. The marshal in Missoula had investigated Thomas's claims. Jake Hutchins had indeed disappeared the week after the theft, leaving behind his belongings but taking all his savings. A witness had come forward, another ranch hand who'd seen Jake near the office the night of the theft, but had been too frightened to speak up before. The Brennan brothers had confirmed Thomas's story about the changed patrol route. Marcus Brennan had officially cleared Thomas of all charges and sent his apologies for his son's behavior. "You're free," Delilah breathed, looking up at Thomas with tears streaming down her face. "You're cleared." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. She could feel the tension draining out of him, the weight he'd been carrying for months finally lifting. "I can stay. I can really stay." "Did you think I'd let you go?" She laughed through her tears. "Thomas Wyatt, you're stuck with me now." "Best news I've ever gotten," he murmured against her hair. That night, Thomas asked Delilah to marry him properly, getting down on one knee in the parlor with his hat in his hands and his heart in his eyes. He didn't have a ring, but he offered her something better. His promise to love her and stand beside her for all the days of his life, to be her partner in building something lasting and good. Delilah said yes without hesitation, pulling him to his feet and kissing him until they were both breathless and laughing. They decided to have a simple ceremony in town as soon as the arrangements could be made. Delilah's aunt in Philadelphia sent her congratulations and a beautiful lace veil that had belonged to Delilah's mother. The townspeople, who had watched Delilah struggle alone for months, were genuinely happy to see her find a partner who clearly adored her. They were married on a crisp October day in 1883 in the small church in Republic, with half the town in attendance. Delilah wore her mother's veil and a simple white dress she'd sewn herself. Thomas wore a new suit purchased specially for the occasion, and when he saw Delilah walking toward him down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Delilah with such tenderness and joy that several people in the congregation wiped their eyes. They held a celebration at the ranch afterward, with music and dancing and food contributed by neighbors who wanted to welcome Thomas into the community. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Thomas and Delilah stood together on the porch, watching the last of the wagons disappear down the road. Thomas wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible," Delilah replied, leaning back against him. "Who would have thought that day you rode up to my ranch, dusty and desperate, that we'd end up here?" "I rode 1,000 miles looking for help," Thomas said, turning her in his arms so he could look into her eyes. "But what I found was so much more. I found home. I found purpose. I found you, Delilah, and you're the only destination I need." She kissed him as the stars began to appear, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their first kiss, and now their wedding day. "And you're mine. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Their first year of marriage was filled with hard work and deep happiness. Thomas proved to be everything Delilah had hoped for in a partner: strong when she needed support, gentle when she needed comfort, and always willing to listen to her ideas and opinions. They expanded the ranch's operations, buying more breeding stock and improving the existing buildings. Thomas built an addition onto the house, adding a larger bedroom and a proper office for Delilah to manage the ranch's accounts. When winter came, they spent long evenings by the fire, reading together or simply talking about their days. Thomas had a gift for storytelling, and Delilah loved hearing about his childhood adventures with his father. She shared her own memories, and slowly the losses they'd both suffered became integrated into the larger story of their lives rather than wounds that defined them. In the spring of 1884, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one morning over breakfast, watching nervously for his reaction. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, wonder, and finally pure joy, before he jumped up and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We're having a baby," he kept saying, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "We're really having a baby." "We are," Delilah confirmed, her own happiness bubbling over. "In about 6 months, if I've calculated correctly." Thomas became almost comically protective, insisting that Delilah shouldn't do any heavy lifting or ride horses or work too long in the sun. She tolerated his concern with good humor, knowing it came from love, but she also continued doing most of her regular tasks. She was pregnant, not made of glass, and there was work to be done. As her belly grew, Thomas would talk to the baby, telling it about the ranch and the horses and how much he already loved it. Delilah would stroke his hair and marvel at how much her life had changed in just 2 years. She'd gone from grieving and alone to married and expecting, from struggling to keep the ranch running to building something even better with a partner she loved. Their son was born on a cold November night in 1884. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Thomas paced outside the bedroom, pale with worry, while the midwife from town attended Delilah. But when he finally heard the baby's first cry, he burst into the room and found Delilah exhausted but smiling, holding a red-faced, squalling infant. "A boy," the midwife announced, "healthy and strong." Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at his son with wonder. "He's perfect," he whispered. "He has your nose," Delilah said fondly, though truthfully the baby mostly just looked like a baby. They named him James after Thomas's father, with the middle name Frank after Delilah's. Little James Wyatt was a content baby, sleeping well and eating eagerly, and both his parents fell completely in love with him. Thomas would spend hours just watching the baby sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and the way his mouth moved even in dreams. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Thomas confessed one night, holding James against his chest while Delilah rested. "You and him, you're my whole world." "And you're ours," Delilah said softly. "Our family." The ranch continued to prosper. Word spread about the quality of their horses, and buyers came from as far as Oregon and Montana to purchase breeding stock. Thomas's knowledge of freight routes and contacts proved invaluable in shipping horses to distant buyers, and Delilah's head for business ensured they turned a good profit. When James was 2 years old, toddling around the ranch and chattering in his own language, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. This time Thomas was calmer, though no less excited. He'd learned from the first pregnancy that Delilah was stronger than he sometimes gave her credit for, and he trusted her to know her own limits. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1887, an easy birth compared to James's arrival. She came into the world with a lusty cry and a head full of dark hair like her mother's. They named her Grace, and she proved to be as spirited as her brother was calm. Life fell into a beautiful pattern. The ranch grew steadily more successful, and they were able to hire 2 permanent ranch hands to help with the work. Thomas built a larger barn and a separate stable for the breeding mares. Delilah started a vegetable garden that became the envy of the county, and she sold her surplus produce in town for extra income. James grew into a curious, gentle boy who loved the horses and followed his father everywhere. Grace was fearless and independent, insisting on doing everything herself from the time she could walk. Delilah and Thomas watched their children grow with pride and wonder, grateful every day for the family they'd built. One evening in the fall of 1889, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Delilah sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of the day. "You remember the first time you saw me?" Thomas asked, reaching for Delilah's hand. "Of course. You were covered in dust, looking exhausted and desperate, and I was suspicious of you. And yet you let me stay." "My father would have done the same," Delilah smiled, "and I'm very glad I did." "I was so lost back then," Thomas said thoughtfully. "Running from a crime I didn't commit, no idea where I was going or what I'd do. I thought maybe your father could help me prove my innocence, but I never imagined I'd find this." He gestured at the ranch, the house, the life they'd built. A home, a family. Everything I'd ever wanted but never thought I'd have. "I was lost too, in a different way," Delilah admitted. "Trying to prove I could manage alone, terrified of failing, of losing everything my parents had built. But I was so lonely, Thomas. I didn't realize how lonely until you arrived, and suddenly I had someone to talk to share the burden with." "We saved each other," Thomas said simply. "We did." Delilah leaned her head on his shoulder, "and we built something beautiful." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to deep blue. Somewhere in the house, one of the children called out in sleep, and Delilah started to rise, but the sound quieted again. Thomas pulled her closer. "I love you," he said, "more with every passing year. You're still the only destination I need, Delilah. Everything else is just the journey." "I love you too," she whispered, "my wandering cowboy who found his way home." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There was the year a late frost killed half their apple trees, and they had to replant. The year James broke his arm falling off a horse, and Delilah nearly went gray with worry. The year Grace decided she wanted to be a doctor, and they had to figure out how to support that dream in a time and place where female doctors were rare. But through it all, Thomas and Delilah stood together, their love the foundation upon which everything else was built. They made decisions together, celebrated victories together, weathered losses together. The ranch hands joked that they could communicate without words after so many years, and it was almost true. A glance across the dinner table could convey volumes. A touch on the shoulder could provide comfort or support or simple affection. In 1895, when James was 11 and Grace was 8, Delilah's aunt in Philadelphia passed away, leaving Delilah a small inheritance. They used part of the money to build a proper school in Republic, something the growing town desperately needed. Delilah taught there part-time, finally fulfilling her old dream of being a teacher, while Thomas managed the ranch with increasing help from James. Grace proved to be brilliant, reading everything she could get her hands on and asking endless questions about how things worked. Thomas built her a telescope one Christmas, and she spent hours studying the stars, the same stars that had witnessed her parents' first kiss. She announced at age 10 that she would indeed become a doctor, and neither Delilah nor Thomas tried to dissuade her, instead encouraging her studies and writing to medical colleges to understand what would be required. James was quieter than his sister, but he had his father's steady nature and his mother's head for business. By the time he was 13, he was helping manage the ranch's breeding program, with an intuitive understanding of horses that impressed even experienced horsemen. Thomas watched his son with pride, knowing the ranch would be in good hands when he was ready to pass it on. In 1898, when the country was caught up in the Spanish-American War, there was talk among the young men of Republic about enlisting. James, now 14, wanted to go, filled with patriotic fervor and a desire for adventure. Delilah was terrified at the thought of losing her son, and Thomas sat James down for a long talk about the realities of war. "I fought in the Indian Wars," Thomas said quietly, sharing stories he'd never told before about the violence and loss he'd witnessed. "There's nothing glorious about watching your friends die, son. If you want to serve your country, that's admirable, but understand what you're choosing." In the end, James decided to wait, to finish his education and help with the ranch. The war was over quickly anyway, and Delilah breathed easier knowing her son was safe. But the conversation made both Thomas and Delilah realize how quickly their children were growing, how the years had passed in what felt like moments. Grace left for medical school in San Francisco in 1899, just 16 years old but brilliant and determined. It was one of the hardest days of Delilah's life, watching her daughter board the train, knowing she wouldn't see her for months at a time. But she was also fiercely proud, and she and Thomas wrote to Grace every week, sending encouragement and support. With Grace gone and James taking on more responsibility for the ranch, Thomas and Delilah found themselves with more time together. They took long rides through the hills, revisiting places they'd explored in their early years together. They traveled to Seattle for their 15th anniversary, staying in a real hotel and seeing the bustling city that was so different from their quiet ranch. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked one night as they stood on the Seattle waterfront, watching ships come and go. "Staying in Republic, living such a quiet life. You could have sold the ranch after your father died, moved to a city, had adventures." Delilah looked at him incredulously. "Thomas Wyatt, I've had more adventure and joy and love than most people experience in 3 lifetimes. I have a ranch I'm proud of, children who are making their own way in the world, and a husband who still makes my heart skip when he smiles at me. What more could I want?" "I just want you to be happy," Thomas said softly. "I am, completely, utterly happy." She took his hand. "Every choice I made led me here to you, to our life. I wouldn't change a single thing." They returned home to find James had managed everything perfectly in their absence, and Delilah realized her son was no longer a boy but a young man, capable and confident. He'd even negotiated the sale of 3 horses to a buyer from Portland, getting a better price than Thomas would have expected. "You're ready," Thomas told his son that night. "Ready to start taking over the ranch operations. Your mother and I have been talking, and we think it's time to step back a bit, let you make the decisions." James looked overwhelmed and pleased in equal measure. "Are you sure? I'm only 17. I was 19 when I rode into this ranch with nothing but a horse and a prayer," Thomas said. "You're more prepared than I ever was, and we'll still be here to advise, but the ranch should be yours to run." It was the right decision. James flourished with the responsibility, implementing new ideas and improvements while respecting the foundation his parents had built. He met a girl in town, the daughter of the general store owner, and brought her to Sunday dinner. Sarah was sweet and sensible, and Delilah could see her son was smitten. Grace came home for Christmas in 1901, full of stories about medical school and her studies. She'd faced discrimination and harassment for being a woman in a male-dominated field, but she'd persevered, and she was thriving. She regaled them with tales of surgeries she'd observed and diseases she'd studied, and though some of it made Delilah queasy, she listened with pride. "I'm going to specialize in women's health," Grace announced. "There's so much we don't know, so many ways we could help women have safer pregnancies and births. I keep thinking about how you almost died having James, Mama, and how it didn't have to be that way with better medical knowledge." "You're going to change the world," Delilah said, hugging her daughter tight. "I know you are." James married Sarah in the spring of 1902, a joyful ceremony that brought together families and friends from across the county. Thomas and Delilah officially signed over the ranch to James, though they continued to live in the main house and help however they could. It felt right, passing on what they'd built to the next generation, trusting that James would honor their legacy while making the ranch his own. Sarah proved to be a wonderful addition to the family, kind and hardworking with a quick sense of humor. She and Delilah became close, working together in the garden and talking for hours about everything and nothing. When Sarah announced she was pregnant 8 months after the wedding, Delilah cried happy tears at the thought of becoming a grandmother. Their first grandchild, a boy named Thomas after his grandfather, was born in early 1903. Holding the tiny baby, seeing his son's face filled with the same wonder Thomas had felt holding James for the first time, was one of the most profound moments of Thomas's life. "It all comes full circle," he told Delilah that night as they prepared for bed. "We build, we love, we pass it on. And the circle continues." "Our legacy," Delilah agreed, climbing into bed beside her husband of nearly 20 years. "Not just the ranch, but the love we put into it, the values we taught our children." Grace finished medical school in 1903 and returned to Washington to practice, though not in Republic. She settled in Spokane, where there was a greater need for doctors, and opened a practice focused on women's health. She never married, too devoted to her work, but she was fulfilled and happy. Delilah and Thomas visited her often, proud of everything she'd accomplished against such odds. As Thomas and Delilah entered their 40s, they found a new rhythm to their lives. The urgent, all-consuming work of building the ranch and raising children had given way to quieter pursuits. Thomas took up woodworking, creating beautiful furniture that Sarah delighted in arranging throughout the house. Delilah continued teaching at the school and started writing down the history of Republic and the families who'd settled there. They took long walks together every evening, hand in hand, talking about their day or simply enjoying the companionable silence. Their love had deepened and mellowed with time, less passionate fire and more steady warmth, but no less powerful. They knew each other's moods and habits, could finish each other's sentences, and still found new things to appreciate about one another. "You remember what you said the night we met the Brennan brothers?" Delilah asked one evening as they walked. "That you'd been running your whole life, but with me you wanted to stay." "Of course I remember. It was the truth then, and it's the truth now." "I was thinking about destinations today," Delilah continued. "How some people spend their whole lives searching for something, never satisfied, always moving. But you found what you were looking for. You found me, found this place, and you stayed." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face his wife, taking both her hands in his. The setting sun cast a golden light over everything, and he thought she'd never looked more beautiful than she did in that moment, with silver threading through her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes. "I rode 1,000 miles and told you, you're the only destination I need," he said, echoing words from their early days together. "That was true 20 years ago, and it's even more true now. You're my home, Delilah. You always will be." She rose on her toes to kiss him, soft and sweet. "And you're mine, my wandering cowboy who finally found where he belonged." More grandchildren arrived over the following years. James and Sarah had 3 more children, filling the ranch with laughter and noise. Grace remained in Spokane but visited often, bringing stories of her patients and the difference she was making in their lives. The ranch continued to prosper under James's management, and he proved even better at the business than Thomas had been. In 1910, Republic celebrated its 40th anniversary as an incorporated town, and there was a big celebration. Thomas and Delilah attended, now in their 50s and respected elders of the community. People who'd known Delilah's father came up to share memories, and younger folks asked Thomas for advice about horses or ranching or life in general. "We're getting old," Delilah joked as they danced together at the celebration, moving slower than they once had but still graceful. "We're getting distinguished," Thomas corrected with a smile. "There's a difference." "Do you have any regrets?" Delilah asked, echoing the question he'd posed to her years ago in Seattle. "Anything you wish you'd done differently?" Thomas considered carefully. "I wish I'd kissed you sooner, that first week when I was still convinced I'd have to leave. I wish I'd had more time with my father, that he'd lived to see what we built. But regrets? No. Every choice led me here to this moment, dancing with the love of my life in the town we helped build." "How could I regret any of that? We've had a good life," Delilah said contentedly. "A very good life." "We're still having it," Thomas reminded her. "We're not done yet." He was right. They had many more years together, watching their grandchildren grow, seeing the ranch continue to thrive, and remaining active in the community. They celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1908 with a big party that Sarah organized, attended by friends and family from across the territory. They celebrated their 30th in 1913 more quietly, just the two of them and a bottle of wine on the porch where so much of their life together had unfolded. 30 years, Delilah marveled. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I love you more now than I did the day we married," Thomas said. "I didn't think that was possible, but it's true. You've given me everything, Delilah. A home, a family, a purpose. You've made me better than I ever would have been alone." "We made each other better," Delilah corrected. "That's what love does when it's right. It doesn't complete you. You're already complete. But it amplifies the best parts of you and helps you grow." As they entered their 60s, Thomas and Delilah slowed down physically but remained sharp mentally. Thomas's joints ached on cold mornings, and Delilah's eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but they adapted. They spent even more time together, sitting on the porch or in the parlor, reading aloud to each other or playing cards or simply being in each other's presence. Their oldest grandchild, young Thomas, was 16 now and showing the same aptitude for ranching that his father had. He'd started courting a girl from town, and watching him reminded both Thomas and Delilah of their own early days together. "You think they'll be as happy as we've been?" Delilah wondered one day. "I hope so," Thomas said. "But happiness is what you make of it. We were lucky finding each other when we did, but we also worked at it, chose each other every day. That's what I hope for all our grandchildren, that they find someone worth choosing and keep choosing them." In 1918, the world was engulfed in the Great War, and 3 of their grandsons enlisted despite the family's protests. It was an agonizing time, waiting for letters from France, reading casualty lists in the newspaper, and praying for their safe return. Thomas and Delilah held each other through the worry, their love a constant in an uncertain world. All 3 grandsons survived and came home changed but whole. The family celebrated with tears and thanksgiving, and Thomas gave a speech about how grateful he was for every member of their growing family. Grace had come home for the reunion, 51 now but still vibrant, still passionate about her medical work. "I'm thinking of retiring soon," she announced, surprising everyone. "Maybe opening a small practice here in Republic. I miss being close to family." It was decided quickly. Grace moved back to Republic in 1919, and the town got its first resident doctor with modern medical training. She lived in a small house near the school and became beloved for her skill and compassion. Having her nearby again brought Delilah immense joy, and mother and daughter spent hours together, making up for the years they'd been apart. Thomas turned 70 in 1923, and the family threw a big celebration. He looked around at the dozens of people gathered at the ranch, all connected to him through blood or marriage or friendship, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was the legacy he and Delilah had built, not just land and horses, but love and family and community. "Speech," someone called out, and the crowd took up the chant. Thomas stood, a little stiff but still tall, and cleared his throat. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, and everyone laughed because it was true. "But I want to say something about destinations. When I was a young man, I thought a destination was a place you reached and then you were done. I rode 1,000 miles to this ranch looking for help, looking for a destination. What I found was something different. I found that the only destination that matters is love. The right person, the right family, the right life." Delilah Morgan, now Delilah Wyatt, she's been my destination for 40 years. Everything else, all of this, he gestured at the ranch, the people. It came from that one central truth. She's the only destination I need. There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering, and Delilah walked over to hug her husband, tears streaming down her face. "I love you," she whispered, and he held her close. They had a few more beautiful years together. Thomas's health began to decline in 1925, his heart giving him trouble. Delilah nursed him devotedly, and their children and grandchildren visited often. On good days, they still sat on the porch together, holding hands and watching the sun set over the land they'd built together. Thomas passed away peacefully in the spring of 1926, with Delilah at his side. His last words were, "My beautiful Delilah, my only destination." She held his hand as he took his last breath, then sat with him for a long time, remembering everything they'd shared. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives Thomas had touched. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath a tall pine tree he'd always loved. The headstone read, "Thomas James Wyatt, 1853–1926. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, he found his destination." Delilah mourned deeply but not hopelessly. She'd had 43 years with the love of her life, and she carried those memories like treasures. She continued to live at the ranch, surrounded by family, and she found comfort in the rhythms of the place she and Thomas had built together. She lived another 8 years, active and engaged until the very end. She taught her great-grandchildren to read, worked in her garden, and wrote a detailed history of the ranch and the family. Grace moved in with her for the last few years, and mother and daughter enjoyed a closeness that was precious to both of them. Delilah passed away in her sleep in 1934, at the age of 73. Her last words, spoken to Grace the evening before, were, "I'm ready to see your father again. I've missed him terribly." She was buried next to Thomas on the hill, beneath the pine tree, and her headstone read, "Delilah Marie Wyatt, 1861–1934. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she was his only destination and he was hers." The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family with the same values of hard work, integrity, and love that Thomas and Delilah had established. Every member of the family knew the story of how Thomas had ridden 1,000 miles looking for help and found love instead. How Delilah had taken in a stranger and gained a partner. How two lost souls had found each other and built something beautiful. Young couples in the family would visit the graves on the hill, asking for blessings on their own marriages, hoping to find even a fraction of the love Thomas and Delilah had shared. The old ranch house was preserved, with the porch where they'd spent so many evenings together, the bedroom where their children had been born, the kitchen where they'd shared countless meals. In time, Republic grew from a small frontier town to a modern community, but the Wyatt Ranch remained, a testament to what love and determination could build. The horses they'd bred became famous throughout the Northwest, sought after for their strength and temperament. The land they'd tended was still productive, still beautiful, still home to their descendants. The story of Thomas and Delilah became legend in the family and in the town. It was told to children as an example of true love, shared at weddings as inspiration, and remembered as proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Thomas had ridden 1,000 miles searching for help, and he'd found Delilah. She'd been alone and grieving, trying to hold onto her father's legacy, and she'd found Thomas. Together, they'd built a life that mattered, a love that lasted, and a legacy that endured long after they were gone. Their story was simple in its way. Two people who met by chance, fell in love against the odds, and chose each other every day for more than 4 decades. But in that simplicity was something profound, something that spoke to the very heart of what it means to be human. We all want to be seen, to be chosen, to find that one person who feels like home. Thomas and Delilah had that. They found their destination in each other, and everything else, all the success and happiness and love that followed, grew from that single truth. They were proof that sometimes the journey matters less than who you're traveling with, and that the best destinations aren't places at all, but the people we love. Their great-great-grandchildren still visit the graves on the hill, still tell the story, still marvel at what their ancestors built. The ranch endures, the family thrives, and the love Thomas and Delilah shared continues to ripple outward, touching lives they never met, inspiring hearts in generations yet to come. Because that's the thing about true love. It doesn't end when the lovers do. It lives on in the children they raised, the home they built, the example they set. Thomas and Delilah's love story became part of the fabric of their family, woven into the very identity of everyone who came after them. And on quiet evenings, when the sun sets over the hills and the wind whispers through the pines, you can almost feel their presence on that old porch, two souls who found each other against all odds and held on tight. Thomas, the cowboy who rode 1,000 miles and found his heart's desire. Delilah, the strong woman who took a chance on a stranger and gained the love of her life. They were ordinary people who lived an ordinary life in many ways, working the land, raising children, dealing with the daily challenges that everyone faces. But they did it together, and they did it with love, and that made all the difference. Their story is a reminder that we don't need grand gestures or perfect circumstances to build something meaningful. We just need to recognize love when it appears, even if it comes covered in dust and exhaustion, riding a tired horse at the end of a 1,000-mile journey. We need to be brave enough to take a chance, to believe in someone, to open our hearts even when we're scared. We need to choose each other not just once, but every day, through all the years and all the challenges and all the changes that life brings. That's what Thomas and Delilah did. They chose each other, they built together, they loved completely. And in doing so, they created something that outlasted them both, a legacy of love that continues to this day. Their journey ended, as all journeys must, but the destination they found in each other was eternal. It lived in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch they built, in the community they helped create, in the countless lives they touched. It lives still, in the hearts of everyone who hears their story and thinks, yes, that's what love should be. Thomas was right when he told Delilah she was the only destination he needed. Because home isn't a place, it's a person. It's the one who sees you truly, accepts you completely, and chooses you consistently. It's the one who makes everywhere feel like exactly where you're supposed to be. For Thomas, that was Delilah. For Delilah, that was Thomas. And for 43 beautiful years, they proved every single day that love, real love, is the only journey worth taking and the only destination that truly matters. Their story ended not with death but with fulfillment, with the satisfaction of a life well lived and love well shared. They both passed knowing they'd been truly blessed, that they'd found something rare and precious and had the wisdom to cherish it every day. And so the story of the cowboy who rode 1,000 miles and the woman who gave him a home becomes more than just a tale of two people in the Old West. It becomes a testament to the enduring power of love, the importance of taking chances, and the truth that sometimes what we're searching for is actually searching for us. Thomas found his destination in Delilah, and she found hers in him, and together they built a love that time itself could not diminish. Their story lives on, a bright thread in the tapestry of family history, a reminder that true love exists and that when you find it, you hold on tight and never let go. The end.